My 6-year-old son Leo accidentally knocked over a plastic cup of lemonade on the pristine white tablecloth. Before I could even grab a napkin, my mother, Beatrice, slammed her fork down against her crystal plate. The sharp clinking sound silenced the entire backyard. She pointed a manicured finger at my little boy and announced to the 40 guests present, "Do not bring your youngest next time, Kendra. He is ruining the aesthetic of this gathering." Nobody spoke up to protect my son. My aunts and uncles just stared at their plates. Suddenly, my 16-year-old daughter Aaliyah aggressively shoved her chair away from the table. She stood up, glared directly into her grandmother's eyes, and warned, "Try saying that again. I am Kendra, and I am 34 years old. Before I tell you how I systematically dismantled my toxic family's fake empire on that very lawn, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to relatives who treated your children like second-class citizens." The annual family picnic was supposed to be a celebration of our legacy. My mother hosted it every summer at her sprawling estate. It was an event designed purely for her to show off to the neighbors. She wore a tailored linen suit that probably cost more than my first car. When Aaliyah challenged her, my mother's face turned a blotchy shade of red. She was not used to anyone defying her, especially not a teenager. She gasped and placed a hand over her pearl necklace. "How dare you speak to me that way in my own home?" she hissed. Aaliyah did not flinch. She crossed her arms and stared right back. "I dare, because you are talking about my little brother like he is a stray dog," Aaliyah replied, her voice loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "He spilled a drink." "Grandma, he is 6 years old. You are acting like he committed a crime." Beatrice stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the stone patio. She looked away from Aaliyah and glared directly at me. "This is exactly what I expected from you, Kendra," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "You have zero control over your household. I spend weeks preparing this catering, making sure every detail is perfect for our guests, and you bring this chaos into my sanctuary. Look at your sister Vanessa." Beatrice gestured grandly to the other side of the long table. My older sister Vanessa sat there looking like a magazine cover. Her 2 children were sitting completely still, wearing matching designer outfits, looking miserable but obedient. "Vanessa has managed to raise a respectable family," Beatrice continued. "Her children know how to behave in polite society. But yours are just wild, Kendra. They have no manners, no discipline, and no respect for the things I provide." I felt my jaw tighten, but I refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing me break. For my entire life, my mother had used these gatherings to remind me of my place. I was the disappointment. I was the single mother who lost her husband and supposedly struggled to make ends meet. Vanessa was the golden child who married a wealthy executive. Every comment my mother made was a calculated strike designed to elevate Vanessa and crush me. I reached over and gently pulled Leo toward my side. He was trembling slightly, his big brown eyes darting between me and his grandmother. "It is just lemonade, Mother," I said, keeping my voice terrifyingly calm. "I will clean it up. There is no need to humiliate a child in front of the entire family." "Humiliate?" Beatrice scoffed, crossing her arms. "I am stating a fact, Kendra. The boy has issues. Everyone here knows it, but nobody wants to say it out loud because they feel sorry for you. You refuse to put him in a proper facility. You drag him to adult events where he clearly does not belong. And then you let this teenage girl disrespect me on my own property." I looked around the table at the faces of my own flesh and blood. Aunt Viv was suddenly very interested in her potato salad. Uncle Marcus was staring at the sky. Not a single person had the courage to tell Beatrice she was out of line. They were all too dependent on her money and her approval to ever bite the hand that fed them. Aaliyah took a step forward, her fists clenched at her sides. "He does not need a facility," she yelled. "He has ADHD, you evil woman. He needs a napkin and maybe a grandmother who actually loves him instead of treating him like a prop for her stupid parties." A collective gasp echoed across the patio. Vanessa finally decided to join the conversation. She sighed dramatically and dabbed her mouth with a cloth napkin. "Aaliyah, sweetie, please lower your voice," Vanessa said, using that condescending fake sweet tone she perfected in high school. "Grandma is just stressed. Hosting is very expensive and very exhausting. We all know your mother cannot afford to chip in for the catering, so the least you could do is be grateful and sit quietly." That was the moment the remaining warmth in my heart turned to absolute ice. I stood up slowly, pushing my chair back. I did not even yell. I looked at Vanessa, and then at my mother. "Gratitude," I asked, my voice echoing clearly over the soft music. "You want gratitude for a plate of dry chicken. You want my children to sit in silent terror just to make your aesthetic look good for people who do not even care about you." Beatrice slammed her hand on the table. "How dare you, ungrateful little brat," she screamed. "Everything you have is because I allow you at this table. You are an embarrassment. You chose a dead end." Before I could even process my mother's cruel words, a shadow fell over the table. It was Connor, my older sister's husband. Connor was a tall, athletic white man who always dressed like he was stepping off a yacht. He wore a crisp Ralph Lauren polo shirt, khaki shorts, and a smug expression that he carried everywhere like a badge of honor. He walked around the edge of the patio with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who believed he owned the very ground we stood on. He positioned himself right behind my daughter Aaliyah. Without warning, he placed his heavy, pale hand firmly on her shoulder. His grip was tight enough to make her flinch, and her eyes widened in surprise. "Now let's all just take a deep breath and calm down," Connor said, using that slow, patronizing tone he always reserved for us. He looked at Aaliyah and shook his head slightly. "Aaliyah, there is no need to get loud and act ghetto in front of the neighbors. We are civilized people here. We do not solve our problems by screaming over spilled juice. It reflects poorly on everyone." The word ghetto hung in the air like a foul odor. My vision literally went red. The absolute audacity of this man to come into my family, touch my teenage daughter, and use that racially coded language disguised as a polite correction made my blood boil. I did not hesitate. I closed the distance between us in 2 seconds flat. I raised my arm and violently swatted his hand off my daughter's shoulder. The sharp smack of my hand against his skin echoed sharply across the quiet patio. "Do not ever touch my daughter," I commanded, my voice dropping an octave. "And do not ever use that word to describe my child again." Connor's smug smile faltered for a brief second. He rubbed the back of his hand, feigning shock and victimhood. He took a theatrical step back, holding his hands up as if I were the aggressive one, attacking an innocent bystander. He looked at my mother, and then at the rest of the family, playing the role of the unjustly attacked peacemaker. "Wow, Kendra." He chuckled nervously, looking around at the rest of the family to gather his audience. "I am just trying to keep the peace here. You know I always try to look out for this family. There is no need for physical violence. But honestly, since we are putting everything on the table right now, your mother is absolutely right. You are letting your emotions ruin a beautiful afternoon that I helped pay for." He gestured grandly to the catered buffet, the elaborate floral arrangements, and the hired waitstaff, who were now awkwardly staring at the ground, wishing they were anywhere else. "Do you know how much a spread like this costs in today's economy?" Connor asked rhetorically, his voice dripping with arrogance. "I do. Because my year-end bonus from the investment firm covered more than half of it. I work 70 hours a week on Wall Street, making sure Vanessa and this entire family can enjoy a lifestyle they could never achieve on their own. I elevated this family, Kendra. I took you all out of mediocrity. The least you could do is show some respect to the people who subsidize your very existence." I stared at him, letting his ridiculous savior complex wash over me. Connor truly believed he was the white knight who had swooped in to rescue my poor, struggling black family from ourselves. He loved playing the wealthy benefactor because it gave him an excuse to treat us like his personal charity cases. He believed his Wall Street money bought him the right to insult my children, command our obedience, and demand our constant submission at every family gathering. He was not finished yet. He looked down at Leo, who was now clinging tightly to my leg, burying his face in my skirt. And as for the boy, Connor continued, lowering his voice to sound almost clinical and concerned. Let us be realistic here for a minute. Leo is disruptive. He cannot function in normal, high-class social settings without causing a scene. You are doing him a massive disservice by dragging him around pretending he is just like every other normal kid. I have some powerful connections at a highly rated residential facility upstate. They specialize in children with his severe behavioral deficits. If money is the issue, Vanessa and I could probably sponsor his tuition for the first year. It would be a decent tax write-off for my firm anyway. It is the best place for him, Kendra. Away from polite society, where he will not be a burden to people trying to enjoy their Sunday afternoon. A residential facility. He was actively suggesting I lock my 6-year-old son away in an institution because he spilled a cup of lemonade at a family barbecue. The sheer cruelty of his words was staggering, but what sickened me more was the reaction of my own family. My mother, Beatrice, nodded slowly in agreement, her face showing immense relief that someone had finally said it. Vanessa was looking at Connor with utter adoration, as if he had just offered to cure a rare disease rather than exile her own nephew. Connor crossed his arms and looked down at me, his heavy gold Rolex watch catching the bright afternoon sun. I am giving you a practical solution, Kendra. You are a single mother, clinging to the memory of a husband who left you nothing but debts and 2 very difficult kids. I am offering you a generous way out. All you have to do is say thank you, swallow your pride, and learn your place in this family hierarchy. He was so incredibly confident. He stood there basking in his own arrogance, completely unaware that he had just handed me the match to burn his entire fake empire to the ground. He thought I was just a broke widow who needed his handouts to survive. He thought I was a low-level desk clerk who spent her days pushing papers for a meager salary. He had absolutely no idea what I actually did for a living or the kind of immense power I currently held in my hands. I did not scream or cry. I simply looked at the expensive watch on his wrist and smiled. My smile seemed to trigger something deep and ugly inside my sister Vanessa. She slammed her expensive crystal wine glass down on the table so hard the delicate stem nearly snapped in half. She pushed her heavy wrought iron chair back and marched over to where Connor was standing, her designer heels clicking sharply against the polished stone patio. What exactly is so funny, Kendra? She demanded, her voice tight with indignation and pure malice. My husband just offered to pay for your son's rehabilitation out of the goodness of his incredibly generous heart, and you stand there smirking at him like you are somehow above us. You have always been exactly like this. Vanessa continued, her face twisting into a hideous sneer. You are so fiercely proud, but for absolutely no logical reason. You sit in your little rented apartment pushing papers all day as a low-level desk calculator, and you actually think you know how the real world works. You do not know anything, Kendra. Connor runs a massive multi-million-dollar investment firm. He manages corporate portfolios that are worth more money than you will make in 10 lifetimes of crunching numbers. He is trying to help you because frankly you are a massive embarrassment to this entire family. The manicured patio was dead silent. But Vanessa was just getting warmed up. She looked at me with a sickening mixture of fake pity and utter disgust. I know you are deeply bitter, she said, softening her voice into a mockingly sympathetic tone that made my skin crawl. I know it physically hurts you to come to my beautiful home and see the incredible life Connor and I have built together. I know you look at my successful husband and realize everything you completely missed out on in your own life. It is not our fault that you chose to marry Marcus instead of finding someone who could actually provide for you. Hearing my late husband's name in her toxic mouth made the air in my lungs turn to solid ice. Marcus was a genuinely good man. He was a hard-working master mechanic who came home every single night with engine grease on his hands and pure, unfiltered love in his heart. He treated me like an absolute queen, and he adored our 2 children more than anything in this world. But to Vanessa and my status-obsessed mother, Marcus was nothing more than a blue-collar statistic. He was just a black man in dirty work coveralls. Vanessa tilted her head, her expensive blonde highlights catching the bright summer sun. Marcus was a sweet guy, Kendra, she said. But let us be brutally honest here. He was just a grease monkey who left you a mountain of medical debt and a broken-down Honda Civic. He could not properly provide for you when he was alive, and he certainly left you with absolutely nothing when he unexpectedly died. Connor is offering you a golden lifeline today. He is offering to fix the massive mess your sad life has become. And instead of getting down on your knees and thanking him, you violently slap his hand away and act like some ungrateful ghetto stereotype. Aaliyah let out a furious sound, a terrifying mixture of a sharp gasp and a deep guttural growl, and tried to lunge forward to attack her aunt. I immediately shot my right arm out and blocked her path. I did not even look back at my teenage daughter. I just kept my eyes firmly locked on Vanessa, the beloved golden child. The woman who had spent her entire privileged life happily stepping on my neck just to make herself look slightly taller. She stood there radiating arrogant perfection. Aunt Viv murmured something in desperate agreement from the far end of the long dining table. Yes, Kendra, just listen to your sister Viv whispered loudly, her eyes darting nervously between us. They are only trying to help you and the boy out. Uncle Marcus nodded along, swirling his expensive bourbon in his glass. Pride goeth before the fall. Kendra, he chimed in, trying to sound wise. You should take the financial help. Do not let your massive ego ruin your poor kids' futures. They were all eagerly waiting for me to explode. They desperately wanted me to scream and curse so they could point their fingers and confidently validate their racist narrative that I was just an unstable, angry black woman who could not handle polite society. They wanted to see me publicly break under the crushing weight of their collective superiority, but I simply did not give them the dramatic show they so desperately craved. Instead, I felt a strange sense of absolute tranquility wash over my entire body. It was the terrifying calm of a silent apex predator that has just locked the steel cage door from the inside, leaving the prey trapped. I slowly looked away from Vanessa's sneering face and looked down at my young son. Leo was still nervously holding the empty plastic cup, his little fingers sticky from the spilled sugary lemonade. I calmly reached over to the elaborate buffet table and picked up a thick white linen napkin. I knelt down on the hard stone patio, completely ignoring Connor, Vanessa, and my mother, who were aggressively looming over me. I gently took Leo's small, trembling hands in mine and carefully began to wipe the sticky residue from his little fingers. "It is okay, baby," I whispered to him, my voice incredibly soft and remarkably steady. "Do not worry about this little mess. Everything is going to be perfectly clean very soon." I stood back up smoothly, dropping the soiled napkin onto the pristine white tablecloth right next to my mother's expensive crystal plate. I elegantly smoothed down the front of my skirt. Then I looked directly at Vanessa and smiled again. It was not a defensive smile. It was a soft, terrifying smile of pure, unadulterated anticipation. My smile seemed to unnerve Vanessa. She shifted her weight nervously, adjusting the strap of her bright red, authentic Birkin bag on her shoulder. That bag was her prized possession, a symbol of her supposed superiority. I stood up to my full height, smoothing my skirt. "Vanessa," I said, my voice carrying perfectly in the quiet air. "You talk a lot about Connor's massive wealth and his multi-million-dollar portfolios. You love to remind everyone how he subsidizes this family. But if Connor is so incredibly rich, I have a very simple question for you. Why was his platinum corporate card declined at the Starbucks on Fifth Avenue 3 days ago when you tried to buy a $5 iced latte?" The color drained from Vanessa's face so fast she looked like she might faint. Her mouth fell open but no sound came out. She looked frantically at Connor, her eyes wide with panic. The perfectly manicured facade she had maintained for years cracked right down the middle. "How did you know about—" She started to ask before she caught herself realizing she was admitting it in front of the entire family. She snapped her mouth shut and took a step back, clutching her expensive bag against her chest, like a shield. Connor reacted exactly like a cornered animal. His face flushed a dark, angry red. "That is an absolute lie!" He bellowed, his voice booming across the patio. "You are completely delusional, Kendra." My card was not declined. The chip reader at the store was broken. It was a technical glitch with the bank network. "You are seriously standing here inventing pathetic lies about my finances just to distract everyone from your own miserable life." He pointed a shaking finger at me, trying to regain his position of power. "I have more money in my checking account than you will ever see in your lifetime, you jealous little rat." But the seed of doubt had already been firmly planted. The silence on the patio felt different now. It was no longer the silence of people watching a train wreck. It was the silence of people doing math in their heads. My relatives were suddenly exchanging very nervous glances. Connor always threw money around, but if his card was declined for a simple coffee, something was very wrong. I did not back down. "A technical glitch," I repeated slowly, tasting the desperation in his words. "That is a fascinating excuse, Connor. Except the barista clearly told you the card was frozen due to suspicious activity, and then you had to pay with a $20 bill you found crumpled in the bottom of Vanessa's purse. You looked incredibly stressed for a man who claims to be a Wall Street titan." Before Connor could shout another excuse, my family intervened. But they did not intervene to question the man who might be lying to them. They intervened to protect their meal ticket. Aunt Viv marched forward, her face twisted in a scowl. "Stop this right now, Kendra," she ordered, pointing a finger in my face. "You have gone entirely too far this time. Making up lies about your brother-in-law just because you are angry is completely unacceptable. Connor has been nothing but generous to this family." Uncle Marcus quickly backed her up. He set his bourbon glass down heavily on the table. "Viv is right, Kendra. You are acting completely unhinged. Connor just paid for this entire catered barbecue. Do you have any idea how much those imported steaks cost? He spends his hard-earned money to bring this family together, and you stand there hurling ridiculous accusations at him. You are deeply ungrateful." My mother, Beatrice, crossed her arms and glared at me. "You are ruining everything as usual," she hissed. "You cannot stand to see anyone else happy. You owe Connor and Vanessa a massive apology right this second. If you do not apologize to him right now, you can take your children and leave my property immediately. I will not tolerate this kind of blatant disrespect towards the people who actually support this family." I looked at the three of them. My aunt, my uncle, and my mother. They were all completely blinded by their greed and their unwavering devotion to the image of wealth Connor projected. They wanted an apology. They wanted me to bow my head and grovel to a man who was nothing more than an empty suit. Aaliyah grabbed my hand, squeezing it tightly. She was furious, but she stayed quiet, waiting for my lead. I squeezed her hand back, letting her know everything was entirely under control. I turned my attention back to my aunt and uncle. "You are defending him because you think he is your personal ATM. You think his wealth is real." I shook my head slowly, feeling a deep sense of pity for their willful ignorance. "You are all so desperate to be adjacent to wealth that you refuse to see what is right in front of your faces. You are defending a man who is actively crumbling under the weight of his own massive lies. But you have no idea what is actually happening behind the closed doors of his fancy investment firm." Uncle Marcus scoffed loudly. "And I suppose you do?" he mocked, shaking his head. "You are a low-level desk worker, Kendra. What could you possibly know about corporate finance or investment portfolios? You should stick to your little spreadsheets and let the real adults handle the big business." I took a deep breath, letting the cool summer breeze wash over me. They had firmly aligned themselves with the wealthy white knight and completely dismissed the black woman they had always underestimated. It was exactly what I needed them to do, because the higher they placed Connor on his pedestal, the harder the impending fall was going to be, and I was about to kick the pedestal completely out from under him. Connor could not handle what was happening. For years, he had constructed a carefully curated image of the benevolent, wealthy white savior rescuing his wife's underprivileged black family. He thrived on our gratitude and our silent submission. But right now, a black woman was standing in the middle of a manicured lawn, refusing to bow down and actively threatening to expose the massive cracks in his financial armor. The polite, civilized mask he wore so proudly completely shattered, revealing the vicious entitlement underneath. He took 3 aggressive steps forward, closing the distance between us, until he was standing entirely too close. He used his height to tower over me, his chest puffed out in a classic display of physical intimidation. His face was no longer the smug, composed mask of a Wall Street executive. It was contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The veins in his neck bulged against the collar of his expensive polo shirt. "Listen to me, you ungrateful little witch." He spat, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you can march in here with your bad attitude and your wild children and disrespect me? You think you can stand there and invent lies about my bank accounts? I own you, Kendra. I own this entire family. Everything nice your mother has is because I allow it. Everything Vanessa wears is because I pay for it." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked him dead in his angry eyes, holding my ground with the unwavering strength of a mother protecting her young. "You do not own anything, Connor," I replied, my voice completely steady. "You are just a loud man playing pretend in a borrowed backyard." That statement pushed him right over the edge. He completely lost whatever shred of self-control he had left. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face, so close I could feel the heat from his skin. "You are trespassing on my mother-in-law's estate," he roared, the sound echoing loudly across the patio. "I will call the police and have you and your feral kids dragged out of here." The word feral hung in the warm summer air like a physical blow. It was a vile, racist dog whistle designed to strip my children of their humanity and paint them as dangerous animals. But the threat of calling the police was the true weapon. In our community, weaponizing the police against a black family is not just an empty threat. It is an act of sheer violence. It is a highly triggering escalation that carries the very real weight of potential tragedy. Connor knew exactly what he was doing. He was using his white privilege as a loaded gun, aiming it directly at my family to force me back into my place. A collective gasp rippled through the gathered relatives. Even Vanessa looked momentarily stunned by the sheer brutality of his words. The threat was so severe, so steeped in real-world danger, that it should have snapped my family out of their trance. It should have been the moment my mother stepped in and ordered him out of her yard for threatening her own flesh and blood. But nobody moved. Not a single person spoke up to stop him. Aunt Viv looked down at her shoes. Uncle Marcus sipped his bourbon, avoiding my gaze. My mother, Beatrice, simply crossed her arms tighter. Her silence acted as a loud, ringing endorsement of Connor's threat. My own mother was perfectly willing to let this arrogant white man call the police on her black daughter and her small children just to protect her precious access to his supposed wealth. Her cowardice was absolute, and it was sickening. Vanessa stood there clutching her designer bag, pretending she did not hear her husband call her own nephew a feral animal. They chose their comfortable lies over my children's basic safety. Aaliyah pressed herself firmly against my side, her breathing heavy and fast. She was terrified, but she was trying so hard to be brave for her little brother. Leo whimpered softly, his small hands gripping the fabric of my skirt so tightly his knuckles were turning pale. He did not fully understand the complex racial dynamics or the historical weight of the police threat, but he understood that the loud, angry man was trying to hurt his mother and his older sister. Connor saw the fear in my children's eyes, and he smiled. It was a cold, triumphant smile. He thought he had won. He reached into the pocket of his tailored khaki shorts and pulled out his sleek silver smartphone. He held it up, gripping it tightly like a symbol of his supreme authority. "I am not joking, Kendra," he warned, tapping the screen with his thumb. "I am dialing right now. I am going to tell the dispatcher that there is a hostile trespasser on the property, causing a disturbance and threatening the homeowners." We will see how tough you act when they arrive with their sirens blaring and put you in handcuffs in front of all these nice people. I will make sure social services gets a call about those kids too. You are going to lose everything today." He was banking on my terror. He was waiting for me to panic, to beg for mercy, to apologize profusely, and drag my children away in utter humiliation. He wanted the rest of the family to witness exactly what happens when someone dares to question his absolute authority. The patio was suffocatingly quiet. Everyone watched, holding their breath, waiting for my inevitable surrender. I stared at his phone. I looked at the smug satisfaction practically oozing from his pores. I felt my son clinging to my leg and the protective heat radiating from my teenage daughter. I felt no fear. I felt a profound sense of clarity. Connor had just played his ultimate trump card, thinking it was a guaranteed victory over my life. Instead of cowering, I reached into my purse. My fingers wrapped around the smooth glass of my smartphone. I pulled it out, unlocked the screen, and opened the keypad. I extended my arm, holding the device up to his arrogant face. "I am not going to beg you to stop, Connor," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy silence. "I will make this incredibly easy for you. Call them. Dial 911 right now. Tell them to send their best officers to drag me away. Do you want me to dial the numbers for you, or are your fingers too sweaty from all that fake confidence?" Connor stared at my phone as if it were a live grenade. His thumb hovered over his screen, but he did not press any buttons. He blinked rapidly, completely thrown off balance by my total lack of fear. The script he had run in his head ended with me on my knees crying and pleading for forgiveness. It did not involve me offering him a phone and daring him to make good on his racist threats. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably behind him. She peered over his shoulder, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows knitting together in deep confusion. "What are you doing, Kendra?" she asked, her voice losing its mocking edge and taking on a nervous quality. "Just apologize and stop acting crazy. You are going to get arrested." "I am not going anywhere, Vanessa," I replied, keeping my eyes locked dead on her husband. "And neither are the police, because Connor is not going to call anyone." "Are you, Connor?" I took another step forward, closing the gap even more. He instinctively took a half step back, his expensive shoes scraping loudly against the stone. "You see, everyone standing here assumes I am just a poor, struggling widow who pushes papers at a meaningless desk job to barely make rent. You have spent the last 5 years patting yourselves on the back for occasionally throwing me scraps. You let me sit at the end of the table, and you mocked my clothes and insulted my late husband. And every time you did, I just sat there and smiled and let you believe whatever made you feel superior." My mother Beatrice let out a loud, exasperated sigh. "We do not just believe it, Kendra, it is the truth," she said, crossing her arms defensively. "We know exactly what your life is like. You are a low-level accountant. There is no shame in being poor, but there is shame in being this proud and ungrateful when people try to help you." I turned my head to look at my mother, feeling nothing but cold detachment. "You do not know the first thing about my life, Beatrice," I said, dropping the title of mother entirely. "When Marcus died, I was completely devastated. I had massive hospital bills, a newborn baby, and a grieving daughter. I came to you for a small loan just to keep our heads above water. You told me I made my bed and I had to lie in it. You said you could not spare a dime because Vanessa needed a lavish wedding to a Wall Street rising star. You chose an ice sculpture over feeding your own grandchildren." Aunt Viv gasped loudly, but I did not stop. So I wiped my tears and I went to work. I continued, my voice echoing with years of suppressed strength. "I took that low-level desk job. But what none of you bothered to ask was who exactly I was working for. I went back to school at night after the kids were asleep. I earned my advanced degrees while you were attending country club mixers. I took the federal exams. I worked 80-hour weeks poring over complex financial documents until my eyes bled. I climbed the ranks quietly because I never wanted to rely on you ever again. I became the knight." Connor swallowed hard. A bead of sweat rolled down the side of his face. His confident posture was rapidly deflating. "What are you babbling about, Kendra?" he asked, his voice suddenly lacking its booming authority. "What difference does any of that make right now? You still do not belong here with us in this family." I slowly lowered my phone and slipped it back into my purse. "It makes all the difference in the world, Connor," I said, taking a deep breath of the sweet summer air. "Because I do not just push papers. I am a lead forensic accountant. I do not work for some small-time tax firm in the suburbs. I work directly for the United States Securities and Exchange Commission in their Central Enforcement Division. I track missing money. I dismantle complex financial fraud. I find the hidden offshore accounts that arrogant men use to hide their stolen wealth." The patio went dead silent. You could hear a pin drop on the grass 20 feet away. My family stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes. The phrase Securities and Exchange Commission hung in the air like an executioner's axe waiting to fall. Uncle Marcus stopped swirling his bourbon. My mother dropped her arms to her sides. Vanessa looked like she had just been slapped. They finally realized they had spent half a decade bullying a woman who held federal investigative authority. The most satisfying reaction belonged to Connor. The wealthy, untouchable Wall Street titan looked absolutely terrified. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and sickly. His mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but no sound emerged. His eyes darted back and forth, desperately trying to calculate how much I actually knew. He knew exactly what a lead forensic accountant for the SEC could do to a man like him. He knew my job was to put people exactly like him in federal prison. And he was about to find out I was exceedingly good at my job. I watched the realization wash over him like a bucket of freezing water. "You do not run a multi-million-dollar investment firm, Connor," I said, my voice carrying a lethal precision. "You run a massive fraudulent Ponzi scheme. You do not invest anyone's money. You take funds from new clients to pay off the old ones while skimming millions off the top to fund your lavish lifestyle and your fake platinum cards." Vanessa let out a sharp, hysterical laugh that sounded more like a choke. "What are you talking about?" "Kendra," she stammered, looking frantically at her husband. "Tell her she is crazy, Connor. Tell her she does not know what she is talking about. We have statements. We have portfolios. We have accountants." "Yes, Vanessa, you have accountants," I replied, stepping closer to the table where the expensive imported steaks were getting cold. "But your husband made a fatal miscalculation. He thought he was smarter than the federal government. For the past 18 months, my specialized team at the Securities and Exchange Commission has been quietly tracking every single wire transfer, every offshore shell company, and every fake dividend payment that came out of his miserable little firm. We followed the money, Connor. We followed it through the Cayman Islands, through the fake real estate holdings in Delaware, and right back to your personal checking accounts." Connor's knees actually buckled slightly. He reached out and grabbed the back of a patio chair, just to keep himself standing upright. The arrogant white knight who had threatened to call the police on my children just moments ago was now physically shaking in his expensive leather loafers. He opened his mouth to deny it, to scream another insult, but his throat was completely dry. "You thought your card was declined at Starbucks because of a technical glitch?" I asked, tilting my head and smiling that cold, terrifying smile once again. "There was no glitch, Connor. Your platinum card was declined because at exactly 8 o'clock on Friday morning, I personally signed the federal injunction to freeze every single financial asset tied to your name. Your corporate accounts are frozen. Your personal accounts are frozen. Your offshore trusts are frozen. You are completely and utterly broke. You do not even have enough legally obtained money to buy a cup of coffee, let alone pay for my son's residential facility." The silence that followed was entirely different from the previous silences. This was the deafening silence of a bomb detonating in a crowded room. The shockwave radiated outward, hitting every single person sitting around that long table. They were not just processing the fact that Connor was a criminal. They were processing the horrifying reality of what his crimes meant for them. I turned my attention to the elaborate buffet table filled with gourmet dishes, expensive champagne, and crystal glassware. I picked up a silver serving spoon and casually stirred the expensive potato salad. My Uncle Marcus was right about one thing, I announced, looking around at the terrified faces of my family. Connor did pay for this entire catered barbecue. He paid for those imported steaks. He paid for this beautiful aesthetic that my mother values so much. But he did not pay for it with his hard-earned Wall Street bonus. I dropped the silver spoon back into the bowl with a loud clatter. He paid for it with stolen money, I declared, my voice ringing with absolute authority. He paid for it using the retirement funds of elderly teachers and the life savings of hard-working blue-collar mechanics like my late husband. Every bite of food you are putting into your mouths today was purchased with stolen funds. This entire party is a crime scene funded by a man who robs the innocent to pretend he is royalty. Aunt Viv dropped her plate. The delicate china shattered against the stone patio, sending pieces of imported steak and organic vegetables scattering across the ground. Her hands flew up to cover her mouth, and a low, mournful wail escaped her lips. Uncle Marcus dropped his glass of bourbon, the amber liquid pooling around his feet like a dark stain. Vanessa was hyperventilating now. She grabbed Connor's arm, digging her perfectly manicured nails into his skin. "Tell me she is lying, Connor," she screamed, her voice cracking with pure terror. "Tell me you did not steal our money. Tell me my house is safe. Tell me my cars are safe. We just bought that vacation home in Aspen, Connor. Tell me this is just a misunderstanding." Connor could not even look at his wife. He stared blankly at the grass, completely paralyzed by the sudden absolute destruction of his carefully constructed life. He was a fraud, a thief, and a coward, and everyone finally saw him for exactly what he was. My mother, Beatrice, looked like she was going to have a heart attack. She clutched her pearl necklace so tightly the strings snapped, sending small white pearls bouncing across the stone patio like tiny hailstones. She looked at Connor, and then she looked at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and growing panic. "You are making this up," Beatrice gasped, struggling to catch her breath. "You are just trying to ruin this family because you are jealous. The federal government would not hire someone like you to investigate someone like Connor. He is a respected businessman. You are just a spiteful little girl trying to cause trouble." "You can live in denial for another 5 minutes if you want, Beatrice," I replied, stepping back and wrapping my arms protectively around my 2 children. "But the federal warrants have already been issued. The subpoenas were delivered to his empty office building yesterday afternoon. The only reason the agents did not arrest him on Friday is because they wanted to finalize the asset seizure first. His firm is gone. The money is gone. The facade is gone. It is over." Aunt Viv was the first to break the paralyzing silence. She took a step forward, her expensive heels wobbling on the stone patio. Her eyes were fixed on Connor, but they were completely hollow. "Connor," she whispered, her voice trembling with a terrifying fragility. "My retirement fund. You told me it was secured in a high-yield municipal bond. You sat in my living room, drank my tea, and promised me it was entirely safe. Tell me Kendra is lying. Tell me my money is right where you said it was." Connor could not meet her gaze. He stared at the spilled potato salad at his feet. His silence was the loudest confession he could have possibly made. Viv let out a sound that was half sob and half scream. She lunged at him, grabbing the collar of his crisp Ralph Lauren polo shirt. "Where is my money, you thief?" she shrieked, shaking him with a surprising amount of physical strength for a woman her age. "I worked 40 years at the post office for that money. I trusted you because you said you knew better than us. You said you were the financial expert. Give it back to me right now." Uncle Marcus was right behind her. The bourbon he had spilled earlier was completely forgotten. The sophisticated older gentleman act he loved to put on vanished, replaced by raw panic. He grabbed Connor's shoulder and violently spun him around. Viv let go as Marcus shoved Connor hard against the edge of the buffet table. The table rattled, sending a silver platter crashing to the patio. "I gave you $200,000 last month," Marcus roared, his face inches from Connor's. That was my commercial loan to expand my dealership. You told me you could double it. What did you do with my money, you arrogant piece of garbage? Connor held his hands up in a defensive gesture. Marcus, please, you have to listen to me. He stammered, his voice cracking. It is just a temporary liquidity issue. The market took an unexpected downturn, and the SEC is overreacting. I can fix this. I just need a little more time to move some assets around. We can sort this out internally. We do not need to involve the authorities. You cannot fix a Ponzi scheme, Connor, I interjected smoothly, my voice cutting through his pathetic lies. The money is not in a municipal bond, and it is not in the market. It was used to pay the mortgage on your Aspen vacation home and to cover the lease on Vanessa's new Range Rover. There are no assets left to move. You bled this family dry to fund your own illusion of grandeur. Hearing about her car and her vacation home pushed Vanessa over the absolute edge. She began to hyperventilate. Her chest heaved rapidly, her breaths coming in short, desperate gasps. She staggered backward, clutching her chest, as if her expensive silk blouse was suddenly suffocating her. No, 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 she chanted, shaking her head violently. You promised me, Connor. You promised me we were wealthy. You said we were set for life. You told me my family was just ignorant about high-level finance. You said they were lucky to have you. She looked around the patio, her eyes wild and unfocused. She saw the furious faces of her aunts and uncles, the people whose life savings had paid for the diamond tennis bracelet currently sparkling on her wrist. The realization hit her with the force of a speeding train. Her entire life, her status, her superiority over me, it was all bought with stolen money from her own blood relatives. She dropped her authentic Birkin bag on the ground, and it landed in a puddle of spilled champagne. Vanessa grabbed her husband's arm again, pulling at him frantically. Tell them you did not do this, she begged, her voice high-pitched and hysterical. Tell them you are a legitimate broker. Show them the portfolio statements. Call your lawyers, Connor. Do something. Fix this right now, or I swear to God I will leave you. Connor violently yanked his arm out of her grasp. His previous facade of the loving, generous husband completely evaporated. Shut up, Vanessa. He snapped, his face twisted in a vicious sneer. Just shut your mouth for 1 second. You think you are completely innocent in this. You loved spending the money. You never once asked how I managed to pull in 20% returns year after year. You just wanted the designer bags and the country club memberships. You are just as complicit as I am. You enjoyed looking down on your sister just as much as I did. Vanessa gasped, stepping back as if he had physically struck her. She covered her mouth with both hands, tears finally streaming down her perfectly contoured face, ruining her expensive makeup. She was completely broken. The patio descended into absolute chaos. The relatives who had spent the entire afternoon kissing Connor's ring were now actively trying to tear him apart. Cousins who had handed over their college savings were screaming obscenities. Aunts who had mortgaged their homes on his advice were weeping openly on the grass. The elegant garden party had transformed into a vicious feeding frenzy. The very people who had watched in silence while Connor threatened to call the police on my black children were now demanding street justice. They surrounded him, grabbing his clothes, demanding their stolen money. Connor tried to escape, but Marcus shoved him against the table. You are not going anywhere, Marcus growled. You will sit here and write me a check. I stood on the patio, watching the disaster unfold. Aaliyah watched with wide eyes, holding my hand. Leo was tucked safely behind my legs. I had not laid a single finger on Connor. I simply turned on the light and let the cockroaches scatter. The people who enabled his toxic behavior were now executing his downfall. The screaming and shoving continued around the buffet table, but a sudden sharp movement caught my eye. My mother Beatrice stepped away from the frantic crowd. Her expensive linen suit was wrinkled, and her broken pearl necklace still lay scattered across the stone patio. But she was not looking at Connor. She was not looking at the man who had just destroyed her sister's retirement or her brother's business. She was staring directly at me, and her eyes were filled with an absolute unhinged hatred. The kind of hatred you reserve for a sworn enemy, not your own flesh and blood. She marched across the lawn, her expensive shoes trampling over the spilled food and shattered china. She stopped just a few feet away from me, her chest heaving with rage. I thought the shock of Connor's crimes would finally wake her up. I thought seeing her golden child's husband exposed as a federal criminal would shatter her delusions. I was entirely wrong. Beatrice did not care about the stolen money. She only cared about the public humiliation. And in her twisted mind, the person responsible for this humiliation was not the thief who committed the crimes, but the daughter who exposed them. "You planned this," Beatrice hissed, her voice trembling with a terrifying fury. "You orchestrated this entire thing just to destroy your sister. You could not stand seeing Vanessa happy. You could not stand seeing her living the life you always wanted but were too lazy and stubborn to achieve. So you used your little government job to launch a malicious vendetta against an innocent man." I looked at her in genuine disbelief. "An innocent man?" I repeated slowly. "Beatrice, he just confessed to stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars from your own brother and sister. He stole from this family. He lied to you for years. Are you honestly standing here blaming me for his federal crimes?" "He made a mistake," Beatrice yelled, waving her hands frantically in the air. "Businessmen make mistakes, Kendra. The market fluctuates. People borrow money to cover their losses. It is complicated high-level finance that you simply do not understand. If you had just kept your mouth shut and stayed out of his business, he could have fixed it. He could have paid everyone back quietly without causing a scene. But you had to bring your jealousy into my home and ruin the family name on purpose out of pure spite." Her logic was so fundamentally broken I almost laughed. She was desperately clinging to the sinking ship because admitting she was wrong meant admitting her entire value system was a lie. She would rather protect a white-collar criminal who treated us like garbage than acknowledge the success and integrity of her own black daughter. "You did not just ruin his firm, Kendra." She continued, taking another step closer until I could smell the expensive perfume masking her nervous sweat. "You ruined this family. You ruined Vanessa's marriage. What are the neighbors going to say when they hear about this? What are my friends at the country club going to think? You dragged our sterling reputation through the mud just to satisfy your own bitter ego. You have always been a dark cloud hanging over this family. You have always been the difficult one, the ungrateful one, the child who never fit in." Aaliyah squeezed my hand, her teenage body rigid with anger. She wanted to yell at her grandmother again, but I gently rubbed her thumb, keeping her calm. This was not Aaliyah's battle anymore. This was the final severing of a bond that had been rotting for decades. "I am not a dark cloud, Beatrice," I said, my voice steady and completely void of any affection. "I am the only person standing on this patio who is not living a lie. I built my life with my own 2 hands. I protect my children. I work a hard, honest job. I did not force Connor to steal. I simply held him accountable. If holding a thief accountable ruins your family name, then your name was completely worthless to begin with." That statement was the final nail in the coffin. Beatrice drew herself up to her full height, her face a mask of absolute disgust. She looked at me, at Aaliyah, and at young Leo, who was still hiding behind my legs. She looked at us as if we were a disease she needed to eradicate from her pristine property. "You are no longer my daughter," she declared, her voice carrying over the shouts of Uncle Marcus and Aunt Viv. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. "Do you hear me, Kendra? You are dead to me. You are officially disowned. I will not have a jealous, vindictive snake in my family. I will not allow you to stand on my grass and look down on us. You have brought nothing but shame to my doorstep since the day you married that worthless mechanic, and you have finally succeeded in destroying everything I built." She raised her hand and pointed a trembling finger toward the massive wrought iron gates at the end of the long driveway. "Get off my property!" she screamed, her voice cracking under the intense strain. "Take your wild children and get off my property right now. You are trespassing. I never want to see your face again. I never want to hear your voice again. Leave my home and do not ever come back." The few relatives who had stopped yelling at Connor turned to watch the spectacle. They witnessed a mother completely discarding her own child to protect the illusion of wealth. It was the ultimate betrayal. It was the absolute lowest point a parent could reach. But as I stood there listening to her banish me from her life, I did not feel an ounce of sadness. I did not feel the crushing weight of rejection that she so desperately wanted me to feel. I felt entirely liberated. Because Beatrice had just played exactly into my hands, she had invoked the sacred boundaries of her precious property. She had used her ownership of this sprawling estate as her final weapon against me, and she had absolutely no idea what was waiting for her in the trunk of my car. I did not move an inch when she pointed toward the gates. I simply turned my head slightly and looked at my 16-year-old daughter. Aaliyah knew exactly what to do. Without saying a single word to her grandmother, Aaliyah turned around and walked calmly down the long stone pathway that led to the paved driveway. The entire patio watched her in bewildered silence. Beatrice kept her trembling finger pointed toward the exit, expecting me to gather my frightened son and follow my daughter in utter defeat. But I stayed firmly planted on the grass, right next to the ruined buffet table, holding Leo's hand. The only sounds left in the backyard were the distant chirping of summer birds and the heavy, frantic breathing of my sister Vanessa. Everyone watched Aaliyah reach my modest dark gray sedan parked near the edge of the manicured lawn. She opened the trunk and reached inside. When she turned back around, she was carrying a large, heavy black leather briefcase. It looked entirely out of place at a sunny, backyard barbecue. It was the kind of briefcase you bring to a federal courtroom, not a family picnic. Aaliyah walked back up the stone pathway with the same deliberate, terrifying calm that I felt. She carried the heavy leather case with both hands, her chin held high, completely unbothered by the stares of her furious relatives. Beatrice slowly lowered her arm, her expression shifting from absolute rage to deep confusion. "What is that?" She snapped, her voice lacking its previous booming authority. "What game are you playing now, Kendra? I told you to get off my property." I ignored her. Aaliyah reached my side and handed the briefcase to me. I took it, feeling the familiar reassuring weight of the leather and the brass hinges. I turned toward the long dining table. It was an absolute disaster zone of spilled potato salad, shattered crystal glasses, and half-eaten expensive steaks. I reached out and violently swept a large floral centerpiece off the table. The heavy glass vase shattered against the stone patio, joining the ruins of Aunt Viv's plate. Vanessa shrieked and jumped back, grabbing Connor's arm again. "Have you completely lost your mind?" Vanessa yelled. "You are destroying my mother's patio." I placed the heavy black briefcase right in the center of the cleared space on the white linen tablecloth. The brass latches gleamed in the afternoon sun. I rested my hands flat on top of the smooth leather. "I am not playing any games, Beatrice," I said, looking directly at my mother. "You just stood there and loudly declared that I was trespassing on your property. You made a very grand spectacle of throwing me out of your home to protect a criminal. You were so incredibly proud to use this massive estate as a weapon to remind me that I am nothing compared to you and your wealthy son-in-law." I popped the left brass latch. It opened with a sharp metallic snap that echoed loudly across the quiet patio. I popped the right latch. It made the exact same crisp sound. Uncle Marcus stopped trying to interrogate Connor and turned his full attention to the briefcase. Aunt Viv wiped her tear-stained face and took a hesitant step closer. Even Connor, who was still drowning in his own impending federal prison sentence, looked up with wide, panicked eyes. He knew exactly what kind of damage a federal accountant kept in a secure leather briefcase. I slowly lifted the lid. Inside, resting on the dark velvet lining, was a thick stack of official legal documents. They were printed on heavy, watermarked paper and bound together with thick metal clips. I reached inside and pulled the entire stack out, placing it gently on the ruined tablecloth for everyone to see. Beatrice scoffed, crossing her arms again defensively. "What is that?" she demanded. "Are you trying to show us your little federal spreadsheets?" Do you think bringing office paperwork to my house is going to magically change the fact that you are no longer welcome here? I do not care what kind of fancy job you secretly have, Kendra. This is my house and I want you gone, Ran my hand over the top page of the thick stack. It was not a spreadsheet. It was a certified bank document, and stamped across the top right corner in massive bold red ink was a very specific legal word. The red ink was so bright it practically glowed against the crisp white paper. It was a word that destroyed families, ruined credit scores, and dismantled entire legacies. I am not here to show you my spreadsheets, Beatrice, I replied, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. I am here to do my job. As a forensic accountant, I do not just track stolen money, I track the physical assets purchased and leveraged by that stolen money. I track the collateral. I track the desperate massive loans taken out to keep the fraudulent scheme afloat. When the walls start closing in. I picked up the first packet of documents and held it up so the bright red stamp was visible to the entire patio. The bold red letters spelled out the word foreclosure. The collective breath of the family hitched. Vanessa let out a tiny confused whimper. Beatrice stared at the red stamp, her eyes narrowing as she tried to comprehend what she was looking at. "What is that?" she asked, her voice dropping to a nervous whisper. "What does that have to do with me?" I took 2 steps forward, holding the document right in front of her face. "You love this estate," I said softly. "But before you call the police to have me arrested for trespassing, you really need to look at this official county record." I pressed the papers directly into her trembling hands, watching her world violently unravel. "Are you absolutely sure this is still your property, Beatrice?" I pressed the papers directly into her trembling hands, watching her world violently unravel. "Are you absolutely sure this is still your property, Beatrice?" Beatrice stared down at the paper. Her eyes darted wildly across the bold black text. Her hands shook so violently the thick parchment rattled against her expensive rings. She opened her mouth to speak, but her voice completely failed her. She looked up at Connor and then back down at the document, her mind frantically trying to reject the reality printed right in front of her. "Read it aloud." "Beatrice," I instructed, my voice echoing across the silent patio. "Read the first paragraph to your lovely guests so they can understand exactly what kind of matriarch you really are." "I will not," she whispered, clutching the papers to her chest as if she could hide them. "It is a mistake. It is a clerical error at the bank. Connor told me the loan was fully paid off. He swore to me it was handled." "You are lying to yourself," I said, stepping forward and smoothly pulling the documents from her weak grip. "Since you are suddenly having trouble with your reading comprehension, I will gladly read it for you." I cleared my throat, holding the paper up. I projected my voice, making sure every single person in the backyard could hear every single devastating syllable. According to the official records filed with the county clerk's office 2 years ago, Beatrice signed a binding agreement with a commercial lending institution. I read aloud, my eyes scanning the crowd. She willingly transferred the deed of this entire estate, this magnificent family legacy she loves to brag about, into a holding trust. She used her home as direct collateral to secure a $3 million commercial bailout loan. And who was the primary beneficiary of that massive cash injection? I lowered the paper and pointed directly at the sweating Wall Street executive. "Connor." A collective gasp rippled through the gathered relatives. Aunt Viv grabbed the edge of the table, her mouth hanging wide open. Uncle Marcus looked like he had been physically struck. They all revered this house. It was the absolute crown jewel of the family, the symbol of our supposed elite status. And Beatrice had secretly gambled it away on her golden son-in-law. "Connor came to you 2 years ago begging for a bridge loan." I continued, piecing the timeline together for the shocked audience. His fraudulent shell companies were starting to collapse. The early investors were demanding their returns and he did not have the cash to pay them. So he panicked. He came crying to his wealthy mother-in-law, playing on her desperate need to feel important. He told you it was just a temporary liquidity issue. He promised you massive returns. And you? Beatrice were so completely blinded by his white privilege and his expensive suits that you signed over the only real asset this family had left. Vanessa snapped her head toward her mother. Mom, she gasped, her voice cracking. Tell me you did not do that. Tell me you did not give him the house. You told me the house was going to be my inheritance. Beatrice could not look at her favorite daughter. She stared at the grass, tears finally welling up in her eyes. He said it was a sure thing. She whimpered, her voice barely audible. He said the bank just needed a signature for compliance. He promised me the house was never in any actual danger. But it was in danger, Beatrice, I said, showing no mercy. Because Connor never made a single payment on that loan. He took your $3 million and he blew it. He used it to pay off the loudest investors to keep himself out of prison for a few more months. He bought Vanessa's ridiculous cars and paid for his country club dues. He left you holding the bag. I flipped to the second page of the document, the paper snapping sharply in the quiet air. The bank started sending you warning letters 18 months ago. I announced, reading the dates from the official timeline. They sent default notices. They sent certified letters demanding payment. And what did you do, Beatrice? You hid them. You threw them in the trash. You pretended the problem did not exist because addressing it would mean admitting that the man you chose over your own daughter was a total fraud. I looked around at the luxurious patio, the expensive catering, the imported flowers. You kept throwing these lavish parties. I said, my voice filled with disgust. You kept judging everyone else holding court on a patio you did not even legally own anymore. You called my son a feral animal and told me I was a disgrace while you were secretly drowning in a massive ocean of debt. The final blow came 6 months ago. I continued, turning to the final page with the red stamp. The bank finally ran out of patience. They officially executed the foreclosure clause. They seized the property, Beatrice. The deed was transferred back to the lending institution. For the past 6 months, you have been living here on borrowed time, illegally occupying a property that belongs to a corporate bank. You have been throwing parties on stolen grass. The patio descended into a terrifying dead silence. The magnitude of the betrayal was almost too large for anyone to fully process. Beatrice, the woman who had spent her entire life judging others for their financial struggles, was completely bankrupt. She had sacrificed the family legacy on the altar of her own vanity. Aunt Viv shook her head slowly, tears streaming down her face. How could you, Beatrice? She sobbed. Our parents worked their entire lives to buy this land. They suffered and scraped to build this house for the family, and you just gave it away to this criminal. Uncle Marcus was equally devastated. You are a fool, Beatrice. He spat, his voice filled with raw contempt. You let him play you. You sold us all out just so you could pretend you were high society. Beatrice finally broke. She covered her face with her hands and began to sob uncontrollably. The proud, arrogant matriarch crumbled into a pathetic, weeping mess on the stone patio. She had lost everything: her money, her home, her reputation, and her family, all because she chose to believe a lie rather than face the truth. I stood there watching her cry, feeling a profound sense of closure. The toxic foundation of this family had finally been completely demolished. There was nothing left but rubble and the naked truth. I calmly placed the foreclosure documents back into my leather briefcase. The collateral damage was absolute, but the fallout was far from over. Because while Beatrice was weeping over her lost estate, Vanessa was undergoing a terrifying transformation. The realization that her inheritance was gone and her husband was the cause of it completely shattered her mind. She slowly turned her head away from her sobbing mother and locked her eyes entirely on Connor. The golden child was suddenly facing a future with absolutely nothing. No trust fund, no inherited mansion, no endless credit lines to fund her shallow existence. Every single promise her husband had ever made her was revealed to be a toxic illusion built on the stolen foundation of her own mother's foolish pride. And Vanessa was not the type of woman to suffer in silence. Vanessa let out a scream that sounded like a wounded animal. It was a raw, visceral sound that ripped through the quiet afternoon air. She lunged across the space that separated her from her husband, her expensive heels slipping slightly on the stone patio. She grabbed the collar of his tailored shirt, twisting the expensive fabric in her fists. "You promised me everything!" "Connor," she screamed, her face contorted with a rage so intense it made her look completely unrecognizable. "You promised me the world. You told me this massive house was going to be mine. You told me my children were set for life and we would never have to worry about anything." Connor tried to back away, but she held on tight. She began striking him repeatedly on his chest and shoulders. The dull thuds of her fists hitting his body echoed loudly across the ruined patio. "You ruined my life!" she shrieked, her voice breaking into a hysterical sob. "You told me I was going to inherit this estate. You told me we were richer than anyone else in this entire miserable town. You made me believe I was invincible." Connor raised his arms to shield his face from her frantic blows. "Stop it, Vanessa," he hissed, glancing nervously around at the relatives who were watching them with horrified fascination. "Stop making a scene. We can still fix this. We just need to hire the right lawyers and make a few strategic phone calls." "There are no lawyers," she screamed, hitting him even harder. "There is no money left to hire anyone. You gave my mother's house to the bank. You stole from our own family to pay for your stupid mistakes. What am I supposed to tell my friends? What am I supposed to tell the women at the country club? My children are going to be completely ruined." Her priorities were so incredibly twisted that even in the face of her husband going to federal prison, she was mostly concerned about her social standing at the country club. It was a pathetic display of a woman who had built her entire identity on a mountain of cash that never actually belonged to her. She raised her hand to slap him across the face, but Connor finally snapped. The polite, wealthy gentleman facade was completely gone. He reached out and grabbed both of her wrists in midair. His grip was brutal and unforgiving. He twisted her arms slightly, making her gasp in sudden pain. "You need to shut up right now," he growled, his face twisting into an ugly mask of pure malice. He did not gently push her away to calm her down. He violently shoved her backward with all his remaining strength. Vanessa stumbled backward, her expensive designer heels catching on the uneven stone patio. She lost her balance and fell hard, landing awkwardly on the ground. Her silk dress tore at the knee, and the violent impact knocked the wind out of her. She sat there on the ruined patio, looking up at the man she had worshipped for years. The entire family watched the brutal exchange in stunned silence. The golden couple, the perfect marriage, the standard by which my mother had judged everyone else, had just imploded in the most violent and humiliating way possible. Connor stood over his wife, breathing heavily, looking down at her with absolute disgust. "Do not sit there and play the innocent victim, Vanessa." He spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You are not a victim. You are a parasite. You loved the money just as much as I did. You never once cared where it came from as long as your platinum cards cleared and you could buy another ugly designer bag." Vanessa began to sob, clutching her torn dress. "I did not know," she cried, shaking her head. "I thought you were a successful broker. I trusted you with everything." "You trusted the lifestyle," he shot back, stepping closer to her. "You never cared about me. You only cared about the image. You spent hundreds of thousands of dollars a year just to prove to these pathetic people that you were somehow better than them. You needed to feel superior to your sister so badly that you drained every account I had. You are the reason I had to borrow money from your stupid mother in the first place." He pointed an accusing finger at Beatrice, who was still weeping into her hands near the buffet table. "I took that massive loan to cover your ridiculous spending habits, Vanessa," he yelled. "Your mother handed over the deed to her house because she was just as desperate to maintain the illusion of wealth as you were. You two deserve each other. You are both completely empty inside." Aunt Viv and Uncle Marcus watched the destruction of their beloved golden child with wide, horrified eyes. They had spent years telling me I should be more like Vanessa. They had praised her marriage and her lifestyle while constantly insulting my late husband and my career choices. Now they were watching their idol sitting on the ground crying in a torn dress, while her criminal husband publicly humiliated her. It was a staggering display of poetic justice. The entire perfect family image was permanently shattered. There was no coming back from this absolute disaster. Vanessa looked around at her aunts and uncles desperately seeking an ally. She wanted someone to defend her, to tell Connor he was wrong, to help her up from the ground. But nobody moved an inch. They were all too focused on their own lost life savings. They looked at Vanessa not with sympathy, but with growing resentment. She was the reason Connor had stolen their money. Her lavish lifestyle was funded directly by their stolen retirement accounts. Uncle Marcus took a heavy step toward her, his face hard and completely unforgiving. "You wore my business loan on your wrist." "Vanessa," he growled. Uncle Marcus stood over Vanessa, his voice thick with rage, but before he could say another word, a high-pitched wailing sound drifted through the warm summer air. Everyone on the patio froze. The sound was faint at first, coming from the main road at the bottom of the hill, but it was growing louder and more distinct with every passing second. It was the unmistakable sound of approaching police sirens. Not just one siren, but several overlapping and echoing through the wealthy suburban neighborhood. Vanessa scrambled backward on the stone patio, her eyes wide with fresh terror. She looked at her husband, expecting him to run. But Connor did not run. Instead, a slow, deeply unsettling smile spread across his face. The smile grew into a chuckle and then escalated into a full-blown manic laugh. He threw his head back and laughed loudly, his voice echoing across the manicured lawn. The sound was completely unhinged. It was the laugh of a desperate man who truly believed he had just found a miraculous escape hatch. Connor wiped a tear of mirth from his eye and looked directly at me. His chest puffed out, returning to that familiar, arrogant posture he had displayed before I opened my briefcase. "You really thought you had me cornered, Kendra?" he said, his voice dripping with renewed toxic confidence. "You thought you could march onto this property, throw your little federal documents around, and completely destroy my life. But you forgot one very important detail. You forgot exactly who you are dealing with and where you are standing." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his sleek smartphone, waving it in the air like a trophy. "I told you I was going to call the police on you, Kendra," he gloated, stepping away from his sobbing wife. "You thought I was bluffing. You thought you called my bluff with your little SEC speech. But while you were busy giving your dramatic monologue about forensic accounting, I silently pressed the emergency panic button on my home security app. I alerted the local police department that there is a violent intruder trespassing on the estate, threatening the homeowners and causing a massive domestic disturbance. The sirens were much louder now, turning off the main road and heading directly toward the private gated entrance of the neighborhood. Aunt Viv gasped and grabbed Uncle Marcus by the arm. "The police," she whispered, her voice trembling with panic. "We cannot have the police here, Connor. We need to handle this family business privately. We need to get our money back. If they arrest you, we will never see a dime." Connor ignored her completely. His eyes were locked entirely on me, his expression filled with a sickening, triumphant glee. "They are not coming to arrest me, Viv," he sneered. "They are coming to arrest Kendra. Do you understand how the real world works, Kendra? I play golf with the chief of police. I donate heavily to the Police Benevolent Association every single year. When those officers pull up to these iron gates, they are not going to see a federal investigator. They are going to see a hostile, angry black woman trespassing on a wealthy estate, refusing to leave and terrorizing my family." He paced back and forth on the patio, waving his hands as he laid out his twisted, delusional master plan. "Once you are in handcuffs sitting in the back of a squad car, your credibility is entirely shot," Connor explained, his eyes wide and manic. "You will be booked for trespassing and disturbing the peace, and when you try to tell them about your little SEC investigation, I will simply tell my high-priced lawyers that you are a disgruntled, deranged relative carrying out a personal vendetta. I will bury you in civil lawsuits for defamation. I will spin this entire afternoon into a story of a jealous sister trying to extort money from my successful firm. By the time you get out of a holding cell, I will have already moved my remaining assets and completely cleared my name." His reliance on his white privilege was absolute. He truly believed that his skin color, his expensive polo shirt, and his zip code acted as an impenetrable magic shield against any consequences. He was banking on the systemic bias of the local police to instantly side with him against me. He was weaponizing the very real racial dynamics of our society to save himself from federal prison. He looked at my teenage daughter, Aaliyah, and my young son, Leo, who was clutching my leg. And I will make sure Child Protective Services takes a very close look at your living situation, Connor added, his voice dropping to a cruel whisper. Because clearly a mother who gets violently arrested at a family barbecue is completely unfit to raise children. Beatrice, who had been weeping silently, suddenly looked up. A tiny flicker of hope crossed her tear-stained face. She desperately wanted Connor's delusional plan to work because if he won, she could somehow salvage her reputation. She wiped her eyes and stood up shakily. "Yes," she stammered, nodding her head. "Yes, the police will remove her. This is still my house until the bank officially changes the locks. I am the homeowner and I want her removed." It was completely sickening. My mother and my brother-in-law were actively conspiring to have me violently arrested and my children taken away just to protect a massive financial fraud. The sirens were deafening, now echoing right outside the tall stone walls that surrounded the property. The flashing red and blue lights began to reflect off the leaves of the large oak trees lining the driveway. "You hear that?" Kendra Connor asked, pointing a finger toward the driveway. "That is the sound of your entire life ending. You should have just stayed at your little desk and kept your mouth shut. Now you are going to lose your job, your freedom, and your children." I stood completely still on the ruined patio. I did not run. I did not panic. I did not gather my children and try to escape through the back gate. I simply looked at the man who was laughing maniacally while the red and blue lights danced across his face. He was so incredibly certain that his privilege was going to save him. He was so confident that the local police were coming to act as his personal private security force. He had absolutely no idea that the sirens screaming up the driveway did not belong to the local police department. The heavy wrought iron gates at the entrance of the estate did not just slowly glide open to welcome the authorities. They were violently pushed apart by the reinforced steel bumper of a massive matte black sport utility vehicle. The expensive metal gates groaned and shrieked in protest before slamming against the stone pillars. Behind the first vehicle, 3 more identical black SUVs roared up the long winding driveway, closely followed by 2 local police cruisers with their lights flashing and sirens blaring. But they did not carefully park on the circular cobblestone driveway like polite guests. The lead driver cranked the steering wheel hard, jumping the stone curb and tearing directly onto my mother, precious manicured lawn. Deep, thick tracks of dark mud were violently ripped up from the pristine green grass as the heavy tires skidded to a chaotic halt just yards away from the patio. The smell of burning rubber and crushed grass filled the warm summer air, instantly replacing the scent of expensive catering. Connor stood up completely straight, confidently adjusting the collar of his designer polo shirt. His arrogant smile somehow grew even wider. He genuinely believed his panic button had summoned his personal army. He stepped forward, walking away from his sobbing wife, and raised his hand in a casual, friendly wave toward the vehicles. "Thank God you guys got here so fast," he called out, his voice projecting absolute authority and privilege. "I am the homeowner, and I need you to remove this woman immediately. She is completely out of control." He pointed a firm, accusing finger directly at my face, expecting the officers to tackle me to the ground. But the men stepping out of the black SUVs did not look like the friendly local beat cops he played golf with on the weekends. They did not wear standard blue uniforms. They wore dark tactical pants, heavy boots, and navy blue windbreakers. Emblazoned across the backs and chests of those jackets, in massive, bold yellow letters, were 3 terrifying initials: FBI. There were at least a dozen federal agents swarming the patio, moving with a rapid, terrifying precision that completely ignored the wealthy aesthetics of the garden party. The local police officers, who had arrived as backup, simply stood by their cruisers, forming a perimeter. They made absolutely no move to assist the man who claimed to fund their benevolent association. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a stern, unyielding expression, marched straight toward us. Connor lowered his arm, his confident smile finally faltering as his brain struggled to process the bright yellow letters on the approaching jackets. "Excuse me," Connor stammered, taking a hesitant step backward. "What is going on here? Where is the police chief? I called for the local police department." The lead agent did not even look at me. He walked right past where I was standing with my children, treating me like part of the scenery. He closed the distance to Connor in 3 massive strides. Connor raised his hands to protest, but he never even got the chance to speak another word. The agent grabbed Connor by the front of his expensive designer shirt, twisting the fabric violently in his fist, and shoved him backward with incredible force. Connor stumbled heavily and the agent slammed him face first down onto the wooden picnic table. The impact was brutal. Connor's face smashed into a tray of leftover imported cheeses and expensive crackers, scattering the food everywhere. His manicured hands were instantly yanked behind his back, and the sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs locking securely around his wrists echoed sharply over the screams of my family. Connor struggled wildly, his cheek pressed hard against the messy table. "You cannot do this!" he shrieked, his voice pitching high with absolute terror. "Do you know who I am? I am a respected investment broker. Call my lawyer. You have the wrong person." The lead agent leaned down, pressing his forearm heavily into Connor's upper back to keep him pinned against the wood. "Connor, you are under arrest by the Federal Bureau of Investigation," the agent announced, his voice a low, booming rumble that commanded absolute silence on the patio. "You are being charged with multiple counts of federal wire fraud, securities fraud, and international money laundering. We have a federal warrant for your arrest and a search warrant for your primary residence and all associated vehicles." The untouchable white knight was completely neutralized, squirming helplessly like a caught fish in front of the very people he had oppressed for years. His white privilege could not save him from federal jurisdiction. His country club memberships meant absolutely nothing to the men tightening the steel cuffs around his wrists. Vanessa screamed, her husband's name scrambling backward on the patio to get away from the federal agents. She looked at the man she had worshipped and saw nothing but a pathetic criminal, covered in crushed cheese and panic. My mother, Beatrice, watched the entire scene unfold, with her mouth hanging wide open. Her precious manicured lawn was destroyed by tire tracks. Her elegant patio was swarming with federal law enforcement, and the wealthy son-in-law she had sacrificed her entire home to protect was currently being read his Miranda rights while pinned against a dirty picnic table. The utter humiliation was absolute and entirely public. The neighbors who Beatrice constantly tried to impress were undoubtedly watching from their windows as the massive raid unfolded. Aaliyah stood safely by my side, watching the spectacular downfall of the man who had called her a feral animal just minutes earlier. Justice had arrived, and it wore a navy blue windbreaker. I did not smile or gloat. I simply watched the federal agents hoist a weeping, begging Connor to his feet and begin marching him toward the waiting black vehicles. The facade was officially dead. He was no longer a king. He was a thief, being hauled away to face justice. The federal agents did not gently guide Connor to the waiting vehicles. They physically lifted him by his armpits and dragged his expensive leather loafers across the muddy grass. He was screaming, frantically twisting his body, and demanding that someone call his defense attorney. He yelled that he knew the mayor and that he was going to sue the entire federal government for harassment. His voice cracked and pitched in absolute panic, stripping away any remaining illusion of his dignity. The lead agent simply pushed his head down and shoved him into the back seat of the massive black sport utility vehicle. The heavy door slammed shut, cutting off his frantic shouting completely. One by one, the federal agents climbed back into their vehicles. The engines roared to life and the convoy slowly turned around on the ruined lawn, tearing up even more of my mother's precious grass. As the black SUVs and the local police cruisers disappeared down the long driveway, the flashing red and blue lights faded, leaving the patio in a stunning, eerie silence. The air was thick with the smell of trampled mud and spilled alcohol. Nobody moved for a long time. The aunts and uncles who had been demanding their stolen money just minutes ago were frozen in shock. Uncle Marcus stared blankly at the driveway where his entire business loan had just vanished. Aunt Viv sat down heavily on a wrought iron chair, burying her face in her hands and crying softly. My mother Beatrice was still slumped near the buffet table, staring vacantly at the red foreclosure stamp on the documents I had handed her. The lavish garden party had become a graveyard of broken dreams and exposed lies. But the most dramatic shift happened right in front of me. Vanessa was still sitting on the damp stone patio, her torn silk dress clinging to her legs. The realization of her absolute ruin was washing over her in real time. She had no husband, no money, no inheritance, and no future. The country club lifestyle she had lorded over everyone was completely gone. She slowly raised her head and looked around at the devastated faces of her relatives. None of them offered her a hand. Nobody stepped forward to comfort her. They all blamed her for encouraging Connor's greed and draining their life savings. She was entirely alone. Her eyes frantically searched the patio until they locked onto me. I stood tall and completely composed, holding my daughter Aaliyah's hand, while my son Leo peeked out from behind my legs. Vanessa stared at me as if she was seeing me for the very first time. She did not see a poor widow or a low-level desk calculator anymore. She saw a powerful federal investigator who held the keys to her entire existence. Vanessa pushed herself up onto her hands and knees, her expensive blonde highlights falling in a messy tangle across her tear-stained face. She did not stand up. Instead, she literally crawled across the stone patio toward me. Her pride was completely shattered. She reached out with trembling hands, aiming for the hem of my skirt. "Please, Kendra," she sobbed, her voice hoarse and broken. "Please, you have to help me." I immediately took a large step backward, pulling my children with me. "Do not touch me, Vanessa," I commanded, my voice sharp and cold, slicing through her pathetic display. She collapsed onto her knees, resting her weight on her heels. She clasped her hands together in a desperate begging gesture. "Oh God, Kendra, you have to do something," she pleaded, tears streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. "You work for the agency. You know the system. You are the lead investigator. You can access the accounts, right? You can unfreeze just one of the offshore trusts. Just enough for me to hire a top defense attorney for Connor. Just enough so I do not lose my house and my cars. Please, Kendra, I am your sister. I am your own flesh and blood. You cannot let them take everything away from me." I looked down at the woman who had spent her entire life making me feel completely worthless. Less than an hour ago, she had mocked my late husband, called me a pathetic clerk, and laughed when her husband threatened to call the police on my black children. Now she was on her knees begging me to commit federal treason to save her fake, luxurious lifestyle. The sheer audacity and staggering hypocrisy of her request left me completely breathless. I stared down at her ruined dress and her desperate, pleading eyes. "You want me to risk my federal career and go to federal prison just to help you hide stolen money?" I asked, my tone reflecting absolute disgust. "You want me to steal money back from Aunt Viv and Uncle Marcus so you can keep driving a luxury SUV? Do you hear yourself, Vanessa? You are asking me to become a criminal just to protect your fragile ego." "I am desperate, Kendra," she wailed, slapping her hands violently against the stone patio. "I have absolutely nothing left. My bank cards are declined. My husband is gone. I do not even know how I am going to buy groceries tomorrow. You have to help me. You owe me. We are family." I shook my head, feeling a profound sense of closure. "I do not owe you a single thing, Vanessa. I replied, my voice steady. You made it perfectly clear today that I am not part of this family. You disowned me. You threw me off your property. You called me a jealous rat. You chose your wealthy white knight over your own sister. Now your knight is sitting in the back of a federal vehicle wearing steel handcuffs. Vanessa stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, finally realizing that I was completely immune to her manipulation. She slowly lowered her hands, letting them rest on her torn silk dress, and began to weep into her palms. Her sobs were the only sound left on the ruined patio until a sharp, desperate gasping broke the silence. I turned my head away from my broken sister and looked toward the buffet table. My mother Beatrice was gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles were completely white. Her chest was heaving uncontrollably as she struggled to pull air into her lungs. The sheer magnitude of the public humiliation had sent her into a state of hyperventilation. But Beatrice was a woman who had spent her entire life surviving on pure stubborn pride, and she was not ready to surrender. She took a deep, ragged breath and forced herself to stand up completely straight. She reached up with shaking hands and smoothed down the front of her wrinkled linen suit. She stepped over the shattered crystal and the spilled potato salad, refusing to look down at the mess. She lifted her chin, trying to project the same haughty arrogance she had worn like a crown for the past 30 years. She looked at the muddy tire tracks tearing through her pristine lawn. And then she looked at me, her eyes blazing with a furious, terrifying denial. You think you have won, Kendra? She said, her voice raspy, but gaining volume with every single word. You think because those agents drove their vehicles onto my grass that this changes anything about who we are? You think a piece of paper from a bank gives you the right to stand there and gloat while your sister is crying on the ground? I did not interrupt her. I simply watched her desperately trying to glue the shattered pieces of her illusion back together. The bank might take this house next month, Beatrice announced, projecting her voice so the lingering aunts and uncles could hear her. The bank might auction off this property next year. We might have to hire lawyers to sort out this massive misunderstanding with Connor's business. But that is tomorrow. That is next week. Today, I am still the matriarch of this family. Today, my name is still on the original deed. Today, this is still my patio and my grass. She was completely untethered from reality. Her son-in-law had just been hauled away by the federal government for running a massive Ponzi scheme that had bankrupted her own siblings. She was currently standing on property that had already been legally seized 6 months ago. Yet she was still fiercely clinging to the title of matriarch, as if sheer willpower could reverse a federal indictment and a bank foreclosure. And you are still banished. Kendra, my mother yelled, pointing her trembling finger toward the ruined wrought iron gates. I told you to get off my property, and my order still stands. You do not belong here. You have never belonged here. Take your wild children and walk down that driveway right now. I will not allow you to stand there judging us. Aaliyah gripped my hand tighter, her teenage mind struggling to comprehend her grandmother's absolute insanity. How can she still be yelling at you? Aaliyah whispered to me. She has literally nothing left. She has her delusion, Aaliyah, I replied softly, keeping my eyes on my mother. And she will defend it until the bitter end. Beatrice turned her attention away from me and looked at the stunned relatives gathered around the patio. She clapped her hands together twice, a sharp, commanding sound that she usually reserved for the hired catering staff. All right, everyone, Beatrice ordered, her voice ringing with a frantic, unnatural cheerfulness. This party is not over. We are not going to let a disgruntled daughter and a few overzealous government agents ruin our Sunday afternoon. Viv, pick up those broken plates. Marcus, help me flip this heavy table back over. Someone go into the kitchen and bring out the backup trays of food. We are going to clean up this mess, and we are going to finish our meal together like a proper civilized family. She reached down and grabbed a shattered piece of china from the stone patio, holding it up as if to lead by example. Come on, she urged, her smile looking more like a painful grimace. Move quickly. We can pretend this never happened. We can fix this before the neighbors start asking questions. We just need to tidy up the yard. Nobody moved. Aunt Viv just stared at Beatrice, her tear-streaked face twisting into an expression of pure horror. Uncle Marcus slowly shook his head, looking at his sister as if she had suddenly grown a second head. They were finally seeing the true Beatrice. They saw the woman who cared more about the appearance of a clean patio than the financial destruction of her own siblings. "I said move!" Beatrice shrieked, dropping the china. It shattered into smaller fragments. "Why are you standing there? This is my house. Clean this yard right now." "You are crazy, Beatrice," Uncle Marcus muttered. "I am not cleaning your yard. I am calling my lawyer." Aunt Viv stood up slowly, ignoring Beatrice. She grabbed her purse and began walking toward the driveway without saying a single word. One by one, the other relatives began to follow her, silently abandoning the ruined party. "Wait!" Beatrice called out, her voice cracking with a sudden burst of pure panic. "You cannot leave. I am still the head of this family." But they kept walking, navigating around muddy tire tracks. They did not look back at her. Beatrice was left standing alone in the chaotic mess. She slowly turned her head back to face me, her eyes wide and terrified. She had absolutely nothing left to hide behind in this entire broken world anymore. I slowly watched the complete realization wash over her face. Beatrice was completely out of options. She looked around the empty patio at the broken plates and the muddy tire tracks. She took a deep, shaky breath and tried to square her shoulders one last time. "The bank might have foreclosed Kendra," she said, her voice completely hollow, but still dripping with stubborn pride. "But there is a process. They have to give me notice to vacate. They have to formally evict me. I know my rights. I have at least 30 days to figure this out and find a lawyer. I am not leaving my home today just because you showed up with a briefcase." I did not argue with her. I simply reached back into the heavy black leather briefcase sitting on the ruined tablecloth. The soft velvet lining brushed against my knuckles as my fingers closed around the final manila envelope. It was much thinner than the foreclosure packet, but it was infinitely more powerful. I pulled it out and held it up to the afternoon sun. The bright light illuminated the heavy seal pressed into the thick paper. "You are absolutely right about the process, Beatrice," I replied, my voice perfectly calm and measured. "The bank does have a process for foreclosed properties. They do not just sit on a massive multi-million-dollar estate and wait for the previous owner to slowly pack their bags. They want their money back as quickly as possible, so they put the property up for auction. They sell it to the highest bidder to recoup their massive losses." Beatrice frowned, staring at the manila envelope. "An auction?" She repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "They cannot auction my house without telling me. I would have known. I would have received a letter." "You did receive a letter, Beatrice?" I corrected her, taking a slow step forward. "You received several certified letters, but you were too busy throwing elaborate garden parties and pretending Connor was a Wall Street genius to actually open your mail. The bank executed a private commercial auction exactly 3 months ago. They listed the property and accepted a blind cash offer within 48 hours. The deed was completely transferred and finalized. The bank no longer has any financial interest in this estate." Vanessa, who was still sitting on the patio floor, completely stopped crying. She looked up at me, her tear-streaked face twisting in absolute confusion. "Someone bought the house," Vanessa asked, her voice cracking. "Who bought it? Who has that kind of money just lying around to buy an estate in cash?" Beatrice looked completely horrified. She raised her hands to her mouth. "Some developer," she gasped. "Some faceless corporation is going to come here and tear down my beautiful home. They are going to demolish my legacy to build luxury condos. No, I will not allow it. I will chain myself to the front doors. I will fight the new owners in court. I will make their lives a living hell." I placed the thin manila envelope on the table right next to the shattered crystal vase. I flipped it open and pulled out a pristine stack of legal documents. These were not printed on standard bank paper. They were printed on heavy, expensive parchment and stamped with the official seal of the state registry. I slid the top page across the white linen tablecloth so it stopped directly in front of my mother. "You do not need to chain yourself to the front doors, Beatrice," I said, my voice ringing with absolute finality. "And you certainly do not need to fight the new owners in court, because you are looking right at the primary shareholder." Beatrice stared blankly at the paper. She leaned forward, her eyes scanning the bold black text. I watched her read the name of the purchasing entity printed at the top of the deed. It was not a faceless development corporation. It was a private holding company. The property was purchased in full by ALK Holdings, I announced, ensuring my voice carried over the silent patio. It is a private limited liability company formed specifically for the acquisition of distressed real estate. I pointed a steady finger at the paper. "Look closely at the letters, Beatrice. Look at the name of the company that owns the ground you are currently standing on." Beatrice read the letters aloud, her voice trembling violently. "ALK Holdings," she whispered. She looked up at me, completely uncomprehending. "What does that mean? Who is ALK?" I placed my hands flat on the ruined tablecloth, leaning forward, so I was looking directly into her terrified eyes. "Aaliyah Leo Kendra," I replied, enunciating each name with terrifying precision. "ALK Holdings is my company, Beatrice. I am the sole managing director. I used the money I made from 5 years of working a high-level federal job. I used the investments I made while you were busy mocking my clothes and my lifestyle. I paid for this entire estate in cash 3 months ago." The patio was so quiet I could hear the breeze rustling the leaves in the large oak trees. Vanessa let out a tiny broken gasp from the floor. Beatrice looked like all the blood had been violently drained from her body. She stumbled backward, her knees completely giving out. She collapsed into a wrought iron chair, staring at me as if I had just transformed into a ghost. I stood up completely straight, absorbing the absolute raw power of the moment. "The bank does not own this house, Mother," I declared, delivering the final devastating blow. "I do. I bought it 3 months ago with the wealth you swore I would never have. I bought it with the money you thought a low-level desk calculator could never earn." The absolute destruction of her reality was finally complete. The matriarch, who had spent her entire life judging people by their zip codes and their bank accounts, was now sitting on a patio she did not own. She was completely at the mercy of the daughter she had relentlessly abused and discarded. She had no home, no money, and no power. The illusion she had sacrificed everything to protect was entirely gone. "You bought my house," Beatrice whispered, her voice completely hollow. "You actually bought my home. You let me plan this party. You let me invite all these people. You let me stand here and act like I was in charge. You knew this entire time that you owned the grass under my feet." "I did," I replied, my voice completely devoid of pity. "I let you dig your own grave, Beatrice. You wanted to banish my son from your table. You wanted to throw me off your property to protect a criminal. So I let you play your hand. And now the game is over." The masterstroke was finally delivered, and the board was completely cleared. I watched her sink deeper into the chair. The expensive linen suit she wore suddenly looked oversized and ridiculous on her shrinking frame. She looked incredibly old and fragile. All the fierce, terrifying energy she used to control this family had completely evaporated. She was just a broken woman, sitting in a pile of ruined catering and shattered glass. Vanessa was still on the ground, rocking back and forth, clutching her torn dress. The 2 women who had tormented me for decades were completely broken by their own toxic greed. I felt my daughter Aaliyah step closer to me. She looked down at her grandmother, and then she looked up at me with profound respect. We had finally taken back our true dignity and our power in the most absolute way possible. The beautiful house was entirely ours now, and the toxic reign of Beatrice was permanently finished forever. I let the heavy silence hang over the ruined patio, allowing the magnitude of my words to saturate the warm afternoon air. The breeze rustled the oak trees, casting shadows over the shattered crystal. I calmly checked my watch. It was exactly 3:15. I directed my attention back to the two broken women occupying my lawn. Earlier, you were eager to enforce the boundaries of your kingdom, Beatrice. I said, my voice steady. You pointed at the driveway and demanded that I take my children and get off your property. You wanted me to feel the weight of being expelled from my own family. You wielded this estate like a weapon to punish me. Beatrice flinched, unable to look me in the face. Now the power dynamic is inverted. I continued stepping toward her. I hold the deed. I pay the property taxes. I own every single brick of that massive house, every blade of grass, and every inch of the driveway you tried to banish me down. I will make this simple for both of you. Vanessa looked up from the patio floor, anticipating the final blow. You told me to get off your property, Beatrice, I said. Now I am telling you that you have exactly 1 hour and 45 minutes left on mine. You have until exactly 5 o'clock to go inside that house, pack whatever you can physically fit into Vanessa's leased sport utility vehicle, and get off my property. Vanessa gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. 5 o'clock? She stammered, her voice shaking uncontrollably. Kendra, that is impossible. We cannot pack an entire house in under 2 hours. I have furniture. I have a massive wardrobe. I have my children's things. We need moving trucks. We need a week at least. Where are we supposed to go? You can go to a hotel, Vanessa, I replied coldly. You can sleep in the back of your car for all I care, but you are not staying here, and you certainly are not taking the furniture. The foreclosure auction included all the primary fixtures and major furnishings left inside the estate. The bank sold the property as is. You do not own the heavy oak dining table anymore, Beatrice. You do not own the crystal chandeliers or the custom leather sofas. All you own are your clothes, your personal items, and whatever fake jewelry Connor did not pawn to cover his massive federal fraud. Beatrice let out a low, agonizing moan, burying her face in her hands. The reality of her absolute destitution was finally sinking in. She was losing her home, leaving it with nothing but a few suitcases. If you or Vanessa are still standing on this grass at 1 minute past 5 o'clock, I will not hesitate to press the panic button on my own security app. I warned them, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. I will call the local police. And unlike Connor, I actually possess the legal documentation to prove you are hostile trespassers illegally occupying my private residence. Do not test my resolve. Move your bodies right now. Vanessa scrambled to her feet, her torn silk dress flapping around her legs. She grabbed her mother's arm, violently pulling the older woman out of the wrought iron chair. Come on, Mom. Vanessa hissed, her voice frantic and breathless. We have to go inside. We have to grab the jewelry and the designer bags before she locks us out completely. Get up. We have to hurry. Beatrice stumbled to her feet, moving like a sleepwalker. She looked around the patio one last time, her eyes lingering on the beautiful gardens she used to boast about to her country club friends. Then she turned and let Vanessa drag her toward the grand glass doors of the massive brick colonial house. They moved with a pathetic, desperate urgency, two fallen queens running to salvage their scraps. As they disappeared inside the house, I turned my attention to the remaining relatives. There were still about a dozen aunts, uncles, and older cousins lingering near the edges of the patio. They had stayed to watch the spectacle, completely paralyzed by the rapid destruction of the family hierarchy. They had watched Connor threaten my children. They had watched Beatrice disown me, and they had done absolutely nothing. They were the silent enablers who had allowed this toxic environment to thrive for decades. Uncle Marcus took a hesitant step forward, clearing his throat. Listen, Kendra. He began, raising his hands in a placating gesture. We had no idea things were this bad. We are all family here. Maybe we can sit down inside and talk about how to handle this transition. We can help you manage the estate. I cut him off with a sharp laugh. Do not insult my intelligence, Marcus. I snapped, my eyes narrowing. You do not want to manage the estate. You want to figure out how you can latch on to the new owner. now that your old meal ticket is sitting in federal custody. You watched that man threaten my 6-year-old son with institutionalization, and you did not say a single word to stop him. You watched my mother banish me, and you just stared at your shoes. You are cowards, every single one of you. I raised my arm and pointed a firm, unwavering finger toward the ruined wrought iron gates at the end of the driveway. The eviction notice applies to all of you, I declared, my voice ringing with absolute authority. You do not get to pack anything. You do not get to wait an hour and 45 minutes here. You all get to leave my property right this second. Walk down my long stone driveway, get in your cars, and never ever come back. If I ever see any of your faces near my children or my home again, I will have you arrested for trespassing. Get out immediately. The aunts and uncles did not need to be told twice. The conviction in my voice broke whatever spell Beatrice had over them. Uncle Marcus jogged toward his sedan, his loafers slipping on the cobblestones. Aunt Viv was right behind him, ignoring the luggage she brought for the weekend. The rest of the family scattered like roaches. Car doors slammed in rapid succession. Engines roared to life, disrupting the quiet afternoon. Within 5 satisfying minutes, the driveway was completely cleared of my relatives' vehicles. They sped through the ruined wrought iron gates, leaving behind nothing but the stench of their hypocrisy. I stood on the patio, listening to the fading hum of their engines. Then I turned my attention to the grand glass doors. I took my children's hands, and we walked slowly inside. The interior of the massive colonial house was a scene of absolute frantic chaos. The polished marble foyer echoed with the sounds of slamming closet doors and hysterical sobbing. I stood in the entryway, leaning casually against the mahogany banister, watching the 2 women who had tormented me completely unravel. Vanessa was sprinting up and down the sweeping curved staircase, her torn silk dress billowing behind her. She was carrying armfuls of designer clothes on velvet hangers and throwing them recklessly into a pile in the foyer. Because the bank had frozen Connor's accounts, Vanessa could not hire movers, and out of sheer panic she sprinted into the kitchen and grabbed heavy-duty black plastic trash bags. Watching the golden child stuff her custom couture dresses into black garbage bags was the most profoundly satisfying image I had ever witnessed. It was the ultimate visual representation of exactly what her glamorous life had actually become: literal garbage. She was violently shoving Prada heels into the cheap plastic, tearing the bags in her frantic haste. "Mom, hurry up!" Vanessa screamed up the stairs, her voice cracking with panic. She said, 5 o'clock. Leave the silver. Just grab your jewelry box. Beatrice finally emerged at the top of the stairs, looking exactly like a ghost haunting her own home. She dragged a single oversized suitcase clutching a velvet jewelry box to her chest. The arrogant matriarch who demanded absolute perfection was sweating profusely, her makeup completely ruined. She stumbled clumsily down the carpeted steps, nearly tripping over discarded velvet hangers. They dragged their pathetic black plastic bags out through the heavy mahogany front doors toward Vanessa's leased sport utility vehicle. I followed them out, standing proudly on the grand front porch with my arms crossed. The afternoon sun was casting long, dramatic shadows across the driveway. But we were not the only ones watching this humiliating exodus. The loud commotion of the federal raid and the panicked departure of the relatives had attracted the attention of the entire neighborhood. The snooty neighbors, who used to peer through their hedges and constantly whisper about my clothes, were now standing openly at the edge of the property. Mrs. Harrington from next door was staring with wide, shocked eyes. The wealthy doctor across the street was standing on his front lawn, taking in the spectacular downfall of Beatrice and her perfect golden family. Beatrice saw the nosy neighbors watching her. She froze halfway to the waiting car, her face flushing a deep, horrifying shade of purple. The woman who lived and died by the opinions of her peers was now being publicly evicted, with her belongings stuffed into garbage bags. It was a walk of shame so profound it stripped away every last ounce of her false dignity. "Look at what you are doing to me, Kendra," Beatrice sobbed, dropping a trash bag onto the driveway. "Look at how they are staring at us. You are humiliating me in front of my friends." "They are not your friends, Beatrice," I called out from the porch, my voice echoing clearly for the neighbors to hear. They never were. They only cared about the wealthy facade just like you did. And now that facade is completely gone. Pack your trash and get off my property. Vanessa shoved the last torn plastic bag into the back of the heavy SUV, forcing the trunk lid down with a loud metallic slam. She yanked open the passenger door for her mother. Beatrice slowly climbed inside, refusing to look back at me, refusing to look at the staring neighbors. She stared straight ahead into the empty void of her ruined future. Vanessa quickly climbed into the driver's seat. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely get the key into the ignition. The powerful engine roared to life. She did not roll down the window to say a final goodbye. She did not offer a tearful final apology. There was absolutely nothing left to say. The toxic hierarchy of this family was permanently dismantled. The golden child was entirely broke. The white knight was sitting in federal custody. The proud matriarch was completely homeless. She shifted the heavy vehicle right into drive and slammed her foot hard on the gas pedal. The tires screeched violently against the cobblestone driveway, leaving thick black rubber skid marks as she accelerated far too quickly. They swerved slightly narrowly, missing the ornate stone fountain in the center of the courtyard, before speeding toward the wide-open gates. I watched the back of the leased SUV bounce over the deep muddy ruts left by the federal agents' massive heavy vehicles. The car passed through the gates and turned sharply onto the main road, disappearing forever behind the tall manicured hedges. The neighbors lingered for a few more moments, whispering fiercely before retreating back to their perfect lives. They had witnessed the absolute destruction of the loudest residents, and they would talk about it for years. But I did not care about their opinions anymore. I took a deep and very cleansing breath. The toxic cloud was finally completely and permanently lifted today. The toxic cloud was finally completely and permanently lifted today. I stepped back out through the grand glass doors and returned to the ruined patio. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting a warm, golden glow across the massive backyard. The catered food was still spilled across the stone, and the crystal vases remained shattered. But for the first time in my entire life, this sprawling estate actually felt like a home. It was no longer a stage for my mother's endless performances. It was no longer a fortress of judgment where my children were treated like unwanted burdens. The heavy, suffocating energy that had defined this property for decades had vanished the moment Vanessa's leased vehicle disappeared down the road. I walked down the stone steps and stepped onto the thick green grass. Aaliyah followed right behind me, letting out a massive breath that she had probably been holding since the picnic began. She kicked off her shoes and dug her toes into the manicured lawn. "Mom," she said, her voice filled with a mixture of awe and exhaustion. "I cannot believe you actually did that. I cannot believe this entire place is ours." I reached out and wrapped my arm tightly around her shoulders, pulling her close. "We earned this, Aaliyah," I told her, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "We survived their cruelty and we built our own strength. We never have to shrink ourselves to fit into their tiny, bitter world ever again." Leo came running out from the kitchen carrying a fresh plastic cup of juice. Earlier today, he had been terrified, clinging to my leg while a grown man threatened him. Now he was bounding across the lawn with absolute pure joy. He did not have to worry about ruining his grandmother's perfect aesthetic. He did not have to tiptoe around expensive outdoor furniture or stay perfectly silent. He was just a 6-year-old boy playing freely in his own backyard. He spun around in circles, laughing loudly as he deliberately stomped right through the muddy tire tracks left by the federal agents. Aaliyah laughed and ran after him, initiating a massive game of tag across the sprawling lawn. I stood alone on the grass, watching my 2 beautiful children play. My heart swelled with an overwhelming sense of peace. For so many years, I had allowed my mother and my sister to dictate my worth. I had internalized their snide comments and their blatant disrespect, because society tells us that blood is the most important bond we have. We are conditioned to forgive toxic family members simply because we share the same DNA. But standing here watching my son laugh without fear, I finally understood the absolute truth. Blood does not make a family. Respect makes a family. Love makes a family. Unconditional support makes a family. My mother and sister shared my blood, but they never shared my heart. They only saw me as a prop to elevate their own fragile egos. My late husband Marcus understood that truth better than anyone. He never had a fancy title or a massive bank account, but he possessed a wealth of character that Connor could never even comprehend. Marcus loved us fiercely, and he worked with his bare hands to provide for us. He would have been so incredibly proud to see Aaliyah standing up to her grandmother. He would have been proud to see me finally claiming my own space and protecting our son. I looked up at the clear blue sky, sending a silent thank you to the man who taught me what real love actually looked like. We were going to be just fine. I turned my gaze back to the massive brick colonial house. It was huge and imposing, but it was a blank canvas now. Beatrice had decorated every single room to look like a museum meant to be admired but never comfortably lived in. That was going to change immediately. Tomorrow morning, the deep cleaning would begin. I was going to hire a crew to throw out the remaining remnants of her pretentious lifestyle, and I already knew exactly what I was going to do with her prized formal dining room. That massive room with its suffocating silk drapes and its absurdly long, polished oak table had always been the epicenter of her psychological warfare. It was the room where she held court and handed out her cruel judgments. I was going to completely dismantle it. I planned to tear down the heavy drapes and let the natural sunlight pour in. I was going to rip up the expensive Persian rugs and install soft, padded flooring. That dining room was going to become a massive state-of-the-art sensory playroom, specifically designed for Leo. I would fill it with climbing walls, soft swings, interactive light panels, and everything his brilliant active mind needed to thrive. The very room where Beatrice used to banish him for being disruptive would become his personal sanctuary. As the sun finally began to set, casting long, beautiful shadows across the estate, I felt a profound sense of closure. The long, brutal war was officially over. I had entered this property today as an outcast, and I was ending the day as the undisputed owner. I did not just defeat my toxic family, I completely outgrew them. I built a fortress of my own success, and I locked them outside the gates forever. My children and I were finally safe to live our lives loudly, boldly, and unapologetically. We were free. Sometimes the trash takes itself out, but sometimes you have to buy the dump to evict the raccoons. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family members who thought they were better than you? Tell me your story in the comments. Do not forget to like and subscribe, and remember, never let anyone banish you from a table you can afford to buy. The most profound lesson to take away from Kendra's journey is that sharing blood does not automatically make someone family. For far too long, society has conditioned us to believe that we must endure toxic behavior simply because we share genetics with the people who are actively hurting us. We are often told to keep the peace, swallow our pride, and shrink our own potential just to fit into the dysfunction of relatives who are supposed to love us unconditionally. But this story shatters that dangerous illusion entirely. Through her quiet resilience, Kendra teaches us that true power does not come from loud arrogance or wearing designer clothes funded by massive lies. It comes from the silent, unglamorous work of building your own solid foundation. Her mother and sister built their entire identities on the conditional approval of others and the fragile illusion of borrowed wealth. They worshipped a false savior while entirely discarding the brilliant, hardworking woman standing right in front of them. Kendra realized that she did not need to desperately fight for a seat at a table where she was constantly disrespected and minimized. Instead, she worked relentlessly, educated herself, and ultimately bought the entire estate. Her victory was not just about spectacular financial revenge, it was about reclaiming her absolute dignity. She proved that true family is exclusively defined by mutual respect, unwavering support, and genuine love. When you finally stop seeking validation from people who are committed to misunderstanding you, you instantly create the space to build a life of authentic peace. You absolutely do not owe your loyalty to anyone who treats you like a burden or a second-class citizen. If you are currently holding on to toxic relationships just out of biological obligation, please hit the like button and subscribe for more empowering stories of resilience.